O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy...
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Dusen.
And I'm Casey Hoost, and we're here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds.
In this episode, we are discussing the American Civil War, its causes, its circumstances, its main events, the major players in it, what went on and the outcomes of it, and most importantly, what the Lord accomplished through it to bring glory to his name and to bring people to salvation, and also to set up history for events that would happen afterward. So, we just discussed the Second Great Awakening. The American Civil War came on the heels of the Second Great Awakening. According to revival historians, the last really major revival in the United States happened in 1857 to 1858, and a lot of our source material from that revival comes from the revival that happened in New York City, mainly through Presbyterian preachers, where many were saved. And according to reports that you can look at from sources, it wasn't just New York City, but it was throughout the nation that people were being saved all at once in 1857 to 58, which is pretty. I mean, a lot of people don't know about that, and not only in the United States, but also actually at the same time it was happening in Great Britain. So, for the Civil War, so we're going to start with the causes and circumstances of the American Civil War. Just to note the relevance of it to today's situation. We are in a divided society in the United States. You really could call the United States the divided states, to be honest. It's not really that united. I mean, we are united, obviously, in terms of language, society, culture, our governments, and many other institutions. But besides that, there's a huge divide in our ideologies, in our philosophies, and the ways we want to live and the ways we want to think. So it's relevant, and it teaches, the Civil War teaches us valuable lessons about how to navigate through a conflicted society and how to be faithful Christians in the midst of it as well. And also in the midst of tribulation and tragedy, how to maintain our faith and to proclaim the gospel to those around us. We're going to see in the Civil War that there were many people who were devout believers, especially on the southern side, that a lot of times get vilified, but they were actually faithful servants of Christ, doing what they thought was right, living according to their consciences. So we're going to see that in our discussion in this episode. But to get to the causes of the American Civil War, I'd say, so to list a few of them, first of all, there is a huge economic divide between the North and South. The North being an industrialized society with the factories, the major factories, and textiles and...
Yeah, more commerce and banking.
Right, banking especially, yeah. Not only that, so compared to that, you look at the South, and it's still mostly agrarian, agricultural, with these farms, with large plantations, and obviously it is largely dependent upon slavery, upon the labor of slaves that were originally Africans, and now most of them are actually Americans, really. They've assimilated, really, into their own culture, but it's no longer African anymore. So it's, slavery is a huge issue. It is not the issue in the beginning of the Civil War, but it is a huge issue that divides North and South, because all of the northern states by this point of the Civil War have outlawed slavery. The South has not, obviously.
I guess I want to pause you there too, and just to point out the differences in the views of the North and the South with slavery, just about how people like kind of change their politics or make their politics match what their lifestyle shows. And so just how the North looks at the South and says slavery is so bad, how could you possibly do it? The South looks at the North and says, we treat our slaves better than you treat your factory workers. Like, I don't get it. And just how, like, both those things can be true, that there are slaves in the South that are being treated terrible, but then you also have, slumlords and people, immigrants coming in that are just dying in the streets all the time too, and that they just get a blind eye turned to that as well. Just interesting how with their lifestyle, it's easy to look at the other side and say this is an area where you're really missing.
Yeah. I would also add to that, because there was a huge abolitionist movement, which is another contributing factor to the Civil War. The radical abolitionists, which was a minority movement in the North, most people were not pushing to have slavery completely outlawed immediately. It was a small number of elites, political elites, and economic elites that were pushing for this, and it came to a culmination with John Brown, the most radical person of them all, and his followers.
Which even as the war starts with Abraham Lincoln, or as he gets in office, like he said multiple times, he wanted to not touch slavery.
Right.
It wasn't until the war was underway that he kind of viewed it as a wartime measure.
Right.
To really go after it.
Exactly. Yeah, he was not an abolitionist to begin with. But I was going to say that just because there was this abolitionist movement in the North and non-abolitionism in the South, in fact, in the South, most Southerners were not of the opinion that slavery would be a perpetual institution, that eventually it would die out. They didn't want to get rid of their slaves, a lot of them, because in order to do so, you would throw them out into a society where they would not be able to have means to start a new life for themselves. But also to add to that, to their view that slavery would eventually be done and gone with, many slaveholders actually allowed their slaves to earn money for themselves, so that many of them earned enough money so they were able to buy their freedom from their masters. So you have that. It's not like it was universal that the slavery in the South was just these white people who hated their blacks and treated them as less than human, and these black people were treated miserably and had nothing in order to live lives.
I also want to point out though too, as I agree, there's definitely a racism as far as whites are superior to blacks, but this is not just a Southern thing. This is across the whole country. In the North, the Northerners were also very racist. Thought that if blacks were up there, they wanted them segregated. They didn't want anything to do with them. So this was still a problem that would have had to been dealt with in our country at some point. But this was not an issue. Racism wasn't an issue. It was slavery. That basically all the whites in the country were racist. I shouldn't say all, but
a lot of them.
Probably
the majority. That's what I was going to point out, that the Northerners were basically just as racist as the Southerners. And a lot of times, because the Southerners were so used to being with blacks.
Yeah, they actually had to live with them.
Whereas in the North, you had less blacks, that the Southerners saw more humanity in the blacks than the Northerners did, because the Northerners just had heard of these black people and never seen them or lived with them, whereas the Southerners actually saw, yes, they're human and they're just like us.
Yeah, I mean, and I would say in the South is a mixed bag. Like, you get a lot of slave owners that treat their slaves very well, but you do have some that treat their slaves very poorly.
Of course. Yeah. Just like you have the factory owners in the North that treat their factory slaves really very poorly.
Yeah.
But also, we should point out the fact that in the South, it was a small minority of people who actually held slaves, who actually owned slaves.
Yeah.
Of the population, a great majority. I forgot what the number is. I think it was like 13% near the beginning.
Yeah,
of the
I think
war.
I heard 5 to 15, so that would be
13%, 10% of the Southern population actually owned slaves. The rest of them did not own slaves. Most of them obviously were pretty much poor farmers, and they didn't have a stake in slavery. It was the major, economic people and the politicians that had a stake in slavery. Along with that, it was westward expansion. We see before the Civil War, we're expanding into the west. We get the Missouri Purchase. Is that what it is? Louisiana Purchase,
yeah.
Which included Missouri.
Yeah.
Am I right about that? From the French.
Yeah.
At some point in the early 1800s.
Like, I'm thinking 1804, but
okay.
Somewhere right around then.
But now we're settling states in the West by the mid 1800s.
Yeah, and then there's also the Mexican American War
in the 1840s.
In the 1840s, where we won basically like all the territory now that's like California, New Mexico, Arizona, and before that, Texas has seceded from Mexico and then joined the Union.
Yeah.
Basically, there's a lot of room to the west to go, and part of the issue with that is slavery, in that the North also most Northerners don't view it as we need to fight to end slavery. They just want to contain it.
Right.
Like, it's fine if it's in the South. We don't want it moving west.
Mm-hmm.
And there's different arguments for that. Some people say they just didn't want black people out there.
A lot of them didn't. Actually.
But the Southerners, though, they're like, we want to stake a couple things for them. We want a stake in the West, and if you're saying we can't take slaves out there, that kind of like prohibits us from going.
Mm-hmm.
Especially like the wealthy ones that owned a lot of slaves.
Yeah.
And then also the power in the Senate, as far as the way the U.S. government was set up, was that the slave states and the non-slave states were pretty much equal. So the slave states would be able to hold back any anti-slavery measures if they wanted to. They would come through. But if more states come in and those do not have slaves, then the slave states are then outnumbered. And if everybody else wants to vote in something that gets rid of slavery, that's out. So the slave states are like, no, we need to at least have equal numbers, and we need to be able to go out west.
Yeah.
And so that was westward expansion. Is they're trying to figure out how to do with that. They come up with a number of different compromises as they keep moving west, but it's just
3/5 compromise is one.
No, that was the original compromise when they made the country for how much a slave was worth as far as voting rights, or no, counting population, because population affects Congress.
Oh, okay. I thought that was in the mid 1800s.
No, there was the Missouri Compromise. Yeah. And then there was
the Missouri Compromise said what? That you were allowed to hold slaves in Missouri?
I think so, and was it the Kansas, Nebraska? It may have been the Missouri one, I think, that drew a line, a latitude line going out west that said anything south of that can have slaves. And at the time, this was before the Mexican-American War.
Okay.
So there's not much room to the south, and there's a lot to the north.
Gotcha.
And so actually the Mexican-American War was largely fueled by the South in getting that land, because they're like, we need more land south of that line. Mm-hmm. And then there was the Nebraska-Kansas.
Kansas-Nebraska.
Yeah. Yeah, I got the two states right.
Which that didn't that say, for one thing, it said that the new inhabitants of Kansas could vote on whether they would be a slave or a free slave.
That's where you get John Brown going in.
That's actually where the fighting started.
You get a lot of guerrilla warfare in Kansas,
because you had abolitionists versus slaveholders in Kansas fighting over whether Kansas would be a slave or a free state,
sort of
killing each other.
So to sum that up,
that was in 1859 or something.
I was thinking 1854.
Oh wow! It was even.
But so to sum that up, is there's this new state that they say, all right, we're going to form this territory, and whoever, we're going to vote on it, whoever whoever votes more for whether it's a slave state or a non-slave state. So yeah, so all the abolitionists rush there. Well, not all of them, but several rush there, and a lot of slave people rush there, and they are actually fighting and killing each other.
Right.
As they try to get dominance enough to vote in which way. Which I don't even know. Which way did that go?
Kansas became a free state.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was all leading up to it, and this is all like tensions. The westward expansion, figuring out how to deal with slavery as we move west.
So-called figured out.
Yeah,
really figure it out.
More how to
figured out how divided they were.
Yeah,
how willing they were to go to the extreme.
And
extreme
so it keeps getting tense. And so I want to bring in the idea of secession. That this was from the start of the United States, secession. Most people viewed secession as a right of the states. That if a state wanted to decide, no, we're done, they can leave. Was the idea behind it. And so as we get towards the Civil War, secession is not a new idea. The South, specifically South Carolina, really thought about it during Andrew Jackson's presidency. They thought he was a Southern president, that he kind of felt it out, and he was like, don't you dare leave, and if Andrew Jackson says don't leave, you don't leave, because he is kind of that way.
Manly guy.
Yeah, he would have brought trouble down upon them. And so that was about 30 years before the actual Civil War. But then you even get like in the North, I know Maine a lot of times threatened to secede, but just this idea that
in Massachusetts, right?
I think so.
I'm pretty sure.
I think a couple of blocks in like New England had thought about it before. So you have this idea that secession can happen, but not really sure like for who's in charge, who the president is, what they do. Because like theoretically you can leave, but if the president and the government says no, we don't want you to, like the ball's in their court. What are you going to do about it? And that's why they kind of, when Abraham Lincoln comes up, first of all they threaten. They say if Abraham Lincoln gets elected, we're going to secede. And they view this guy as he's just some Western. They call him an ape or a gorilla a lot.
Yeah.
They didn't think he was
Illinois.
They didn't think he was very smart. Not a lot of political experience. I mean, was he a senator?
That sounds right. I don't think it was for very long though.
Or I don't know if he was. He may have ran against Stephen Douglas and lost.
Oh, okay.
But anyway,
he did run against Stephen Douglas. I thought that was the presidential race, though.
I think that was previously.
Oh, previous. Okay.
Gotcha. When in his younger career. But either way, not a lot was known about Abraham Lincoln, and so when he's coming in, besides tensions boiling to where they were, they thought this is the guy to take a shot on. We don't think he's very smart. He's just this Western guy.
The Southerners thought
the Southerners, yeah.
But probably a lot of Northerners as well, because it was very divided. The presidential election in the North was very divided as well.
I think there were 4 different people on the ballot, and I think Lincoln won with 40% of the vote, just to give you an idea. And basically, none of the South voted for him. Right. But the Democrats, I think, put up 2 different candidates that basically the South voted for. One, I think it was Breckinridge.
Right, Breckinridge.
And was Stephen Douglas the Democrat in the North?
Yeah. Well, no, I thought he was a Republican. I thought it was divided between basically.
No.
Basically, the way it kind of was you had 2 candidates who were being voted on in the North, and then 2 in the South, and they didn't even consider really like the other 2 options in either.
Which and that gives a picture
side.
too of how divided it is.
It was already divided in the vote in the electoral process.
But so it just shakes out that Abraham Lincoln wins because the vote's really divided. Anyway, so that's kind of leading up. We talked a bit about the different economies. That was the big thing, is they're just completely different cultures and economies.
Right. Yeah. So agriculture, you have farms in the South, factories in the North, basically.
And I read something interesting even about the kind of effects of the war, was which direction our country's going to go. Are we going to focus more on industrializing or more on agriculture, the agrarian way, and that the North winning really pushed us forward more into, and obviously the South would have industrialized just at a slower pace. But the North winning, and obviously the war itself, if you look at all the technology that came about in those 4 years, really pushed our country more deep into industrialization, commerce, banking, those types of things. Said this is what and capitalism.
Yeah.
This is what our country is going to be based on economically.
I also wanted to point out another distinction between the North and the South was in large part due to the industrialization in the North and because of these new ideas, new concepts, new ways of living. That was also accompanied by, although you had the Second Great Awakening, you had a lot of influences from Europe, and also from just the seeds of unbelief and rationalism and humanism that had already been in the North for a long time, really sprouted in the mid-1800s, and in large part, the North there was a huge, powerful group of people in the North who were really unbelievers. Were not Bible believers. In fact, a lot of the abolitionists, most of the radical abolitionists in the North were not true believers, did not actually believe the Bible. They ridiculed the Bible. Yeah. They simply used the Bible as, because it was the common authority, they used it to support.
And it was expected. You can look at Abraham Lincoln. He was not a Christian.
Right.
But he often quoted the Bible or used it in his speeches.
Right. In contrast, in the South really maintains a lot of their Christianity, and most of the leaders down there, they were actually devout Bible believers, devout Christians, as we're going to see as we discuss the war. But so really, it came to a boiling point. What sparked the war, I'd say, the man that two men probably that sparked the war. First of all, Abraham Lincoln being elected.
Yeah.
Secondly, because the Southerners saw that if he was elected, then that would give the abolitionists more ability to get into Congress and to push abolitionism and to eventually outlaw slavery in the South.
Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. The Republican Party had just been formed a few years before, 1854, I think, and abolition was like one of the planks in its platform. Okay. Now, Abraham Lincoln was a moderate, so he wasn't. That wasn't his view.
Right.
But as far as the party platform, that was like they saw Republicans and they said, "No way." The South, I mean.
Right.
And so that's one of the reasons why they're like, if he gets elected, we are out.
Right. And probably the second of three major sparks. The second man that really is a huge figure in the sparking of the war is John Brown, who, as we already discussed, he was a merciless killer in Kansas, killing slaveholders, and really he basically led the abolitionist movement in Kansas, eventually making it into a free state. He was a crazy guy, although he claimed to be a Christian, but he was really, if you read about him, he seems pretty much insane.
So beware of crazy men that claim to be Christians.
Right. So he eventually goes to the east. His plan is actually so his grand vision is to liberate the slaves in the South and to form a new society for them to start, probably in the West, where they can basically start their own civilization as free men. And he wants to do this by, first of all, taking I don't know if it was Harper's Ferry specifically, or if it was in the vicinity of Harper's Ferry, but he has a group of followers of men, and he seizes a U.S. arsenal, right, in Harper's Ferry,
I think,
in 1859.
Yeah, I think, if I recall, his plan was, there were multiple arsenals, and that one would be his first one.
Gotcha.
And then, as he goes, to seize the arsenal and to arm other abolitionists, but especially slaves. And then I think there was another one further south that he wanted to move down and seize that and basically just keep it going.
Yeah. So he actually gets a hold of this arsenal in Harper's Ferry. I've been there, by the way. It's a very interesting place. And Robert E. Lee, no less,
the
future Southern general, is the commander of the U.S. forces that cause him to surrender. Yeah, he eventually surrenders.
Jeb Stuart was there too, wasn't he?
I don't remember.
I
It
think
was
he
at
was.
least Robert.
Yeah,
E.
no,
Lee.
Robert E. Lee.
Robert E.
was.
Lee is a veteran of the American or Mexican American War,
And a lot.
He's been an engineer.
Yeah. A lot of the officers in the Civil War are from.
Right.
But anyway, keep going.
Yeah. So he takes John Brown down with his few men.
That was a nice little rhyme there.
Yeah. It's like a special. It's kind of like a special forces operation siege.
Yeah.
It's kind of epic. But John Brown gets hanged eventually. But what this does is show that the Southerners that there's a real danger of abolitionists actually doing something to the effect of arming slaves. There were huge fears of slave revolts in the South. So that is one of the fears that leads the Southerners to secession.
Yeah.
And into support of secession.
And in the North, when John Brown was put to death, he was viewed as a martyr by the other abolitionists, and they worked really hard to portray him as a martyr.
Right. Yeah. So by 1860, with the election of Abraham Lincoln, South Carolina is the first state to secede in 1860, right? I believe.
I think so.
And
I think it's 1861. So
the beginning of 1860.
So once back then, you weren't inaugurated till March.
Oh, okay.
And so I think in like January, South Carolina voted to secede, and then
a few months afterward, 7 other states, or at least a few other.
So I
think
it was
seceded.
7 other states seceded. James Buchanan was the lame duck president. He was a Southerner, but he did start to arm and mobilize to prepare. So it wasn't like he was like, I'm good with this. He knew it was coming. Even as a Southerner, as the president, he felt obligated to try to prepare for it. And then Abraham Lincoln gets in, and he calls for 75,000 troops, and then you get 4 more states to secede, including Virginia and North Carolina.
Was that the 75,000 troops before or after Fort Sumter? Because I wanted to talk about Fort Sumter.
I want to say it was April. Yeah, I want to say it was before, but it's right around the same time. I could be wrong on that.
It's probably afterward, if I'm vaguely remembering correctly.
All right.
That was kind of a trigger, but let's talk about Fort Sumter. So Fort Sumter was a U.S. fort, obviously. So South Carolina seceded. It's in South Carolina, on the coast of South Carolina.
When he says in South Carolina, he means a little island or just off the coast of South Carolina.
Right, on the land of owned by South Carolina. So South Carolina is now, by their declaration, they are no longer part of the United States. So they want all United States forces out of South Carolina. And that includes the forces that are at Fort Sumter. So they surround Fort Sumter with ships and with artillery, and they demand the surrender of Fort Sumter by the U.S. forces for them to leave.
Yeah.
They refuse to leave, so they fire on them, and eventually they surrender.
Yeah, it took 2 days.
And I think with no loss of life, besides, unfortunately, at the end, the U.S. soldiers are saluting the flag, and a cannon explodes or something explodes, and 2 of them die. Even though no one died from the
horse died in the bombardment, though.
Oh, okay.
That's
gotcha. A lot of horses.
Yeah, a lot of horses died.
We gotta remember. That's something you have to remember, that many animals are harmed in this war, sadly.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that I think that is actually what triggers the call for 75,000 volunteers, who are only called for a few months.
90 days.
Right? 90 days, because they thought that they could put down this small rebellion of a few states. At this point, the northern southern states are still part of the Union. They have not yet voted to get out.
Well,
but after the call for 75,000 troops, after the federal government mobilizes troops, then they see that the North is serious about putting down these southern states for simply seceding, which the Southerners believed was a right of the Constitution, that we have the right to secede. So you shouldn't be forcing us to stay to go back into the Union.
Yeah.
So a lot of the states, and most notably Virginia, votes to secede from the Union.
But,
although they split up into West Virginia
Yeah.
and Virginia, West Virginia, being neutral or something like that, or they're pretty much divided.
Yeah.
They're West Virginians that side with the South. Some West Virginians side with the North.
Yeah.
But you were going to say something, Casey.
Yeah, what was it?
The southern states?
Oh, yeah.
The upper southern states?
Importantly, not all slave states secede.
Like Missouri.
And Maryland.
Yeah.
Like, if you think of
Maryland has Washington, D.C.
Yeah, if you think if Maryland had seceded, literally Washington, D.C. is in a sea of Confederacy.
But there were a lot of Confederate sympathizers in
Maryland. There was like Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky. I think there was one more. There were 4 that didn't. I don't remember the other one.
West Virginia is one of them.
Yeah, maybe that's the one I'm thinking of. Anyway, so you get after the 75,000, 4 more states: Virginia, North Carolina, I think Tennessee, maybe Arkansas, all secede. But then not all of them do. And Abe Lincoln knows it's very critical that he doesn't lose. Actually, here's a good quote for you for his religious state too. He says, "I'd really like to have God on my side, but I need Kentucky." So that kind of
that's sad.
It is sad. I mean, it shows a lot of things. You know how he views God, how important Kentucky is to him. I mean, just as far as the other slave states he viewed as critical. But yeah.
Okay, so 75,000 troops are called, and the first, so they actually launch in advance the federal troops into Virginia. So here's the thing, which is weird because so Richmond is declared to be the Confederate capital, which is. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it's mainly simply symbolic. There isn't really much economic value to Richmond. It does have factories, and it is on a river, but it's not like a major economic hub. Like Charleston definitely is one of the major ones. Savannah and Vicksburg on the Mississippi River.
Atlanta becomes one.
But so Richmond is not that far away from Washington, D.C., which is the other capital. So the major theater of war is in the east, obviously. So in the beginning, the Northerners' goal is to capture Richmond, basically.
Yeah.
And that will basically end the war if they capture the Confederate capital.
Well, they think
they'll deal a death blow to them. Well, first of all, if not that, if they simply defeat the Southern forces with a major victory, that will win the war. The South won't have any fight left in them. And we'll see.
So you're just saying what they think, right?
Right.
Yeah. So they go into it, and most of the Northerners, like we said, a 90-day enlistment. They're like, "Yep, we'll win." A lot of them were hoping one big battle, we win, we show them that we mean business, and the war will be over. It won't be some massive economic disaster. And so that's how they viewed it. It's like, "Yep, we'll be a couple months." We'll fight one big battle and it'll be over. And even the South viewed it that way. Is we're better than these Yankee boys. We're farmers. We're stronger. We shoot. We ride.
And also, a lot of the Southerners viewed the Northerners as non-Christians because they saw that a lot of them were deists, universalists, Unitarians, and so on. Those are huge movements in the North. But whereas most of the Southerners were devout Christians, Bible-believing Christians.
Yeah.
So were you going to say something?
No, I was just finishing up that they both severely underestimated each other.
Right.
And they both severely underestimated the task ahead of themselves.
The North. Yeah. In the beginning. At least from the first battle.
I mean, I would say that the North did worse as far as underestimating it. The South definitely they thought it'd be over in a snap too, and they didn't understand either maybe some of them did, but the implications of the manpower and the factories behind the North that you have to keep fighting an enemy that has much greater resources than yourself.
Yeah, and particularly way more people in the North.
Yeah.
But anyway, so just to end with this first half here, with the first major battle. There were skirmishes before this, but first major battle is near the town of Manassas, Virginia, Manassas Junction, near a creek called Bull Run Creek.
Yeah.
And the Northerners go out, and there are Northern civilians who go out with picnic baskets to watch the battle, and the Southerners go out with their army, which is not led by Lee yet, but we have Jackson there, who gets his name from there. So
I think Longstreet's there too.
I don't remember, but anyway, the Southerners take a stand on a couple of hills. Basically, the Northerners launch an assault, and they're first of all they have some success in the beginning, but then Stonewall Jackson gets his name Stonewall there because he there rallies the troops, and he basically has a good defensive position, repulses them. The Northern troops are routed. There's also a cavalry charge, and basically most of the Northern troops are run for their lives, along with the civilians who were there. And it's way bloodier than they thought it was going to be. There's thousands of dead and wounded, and so that's the first.
If I could say two things on that. One of the keys to the Southern victory was that they actually, I think Joe Johnston was like 20 miles away. Mm-hmm. They hopped on a train.
Yeah. And
they brought people, this was like one of the first wars in the world, in history, where there was troop mobility by train.
Right.
And just there's a lot of technology. We're right in the industrial age. There's a lot of technology that's happening that's never happened in war before,
right,
and changes it entirely. And railroads are one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one of maybe the next big battle, the Battle of Shiloh.
Mm-hmm.
There were more casualties in the Battle of Shiloh than every single other battle in U.S. history combined, including the Battle of Manassas. And so just to kind of add to your point that this is way bloodier than anybody ever imagined.
Right.
They picture these wars they've been in before, and none of them are like this, where like this one battle they lose more people than they've lost in every single other conflict combined in U.S. history.
Right. So the results of the first major battle of Manassas is that the Union calls for more troops, and the Southerners...
and this call for more troops is for a 3-year enlistment now.
Right. And the Southerners mobilize to get ready for more fighting as well. And the Western theater ramps up, really, with the Union trying to get the city of Vicksburg on the Mississippi. And the Union forces are going to just make way better efforts to try to destroy the Eastern Army. And Robert E. Lee, shortly thereafter, he's made the commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia, which is the major Southern army in the East, where you have another army in the West for the Southerners. I think it's called the Army of Tennessee, if I'm not mistaken.
It might be. I mean, they were fighting over, first they were in Kentucky, then they had to step back into Tennessee.
Right.
So that's where most of the fighting was.
Right. But we'll stop there, have a break there, and continue on with the rest of the war from this point forward. Hey, do you enjoy reading, studying the Bible, and learning how to become more like Jesus and what the message of the Bible is all about? Well, I have a Bible study blog called Bearing Christ Crucified and Risen. Its motto is to know Christ and Him crucified. I have hundreds of Bible studies and devotional articles, as well as book reviews. And there you can also check out my book, The New Covenant Answer to Western Christianity, Recovering and Applying the Apostles' Teaching on the Church. So if you're interested in that, please head over to bearingchrist.blog. That's bearingchrist.blog to know Christ and Him crucified. So we're back after the first battle of Bull Run, and also I don't know if we want to talk about before the Battle of Shiloh. Shiloh is the first major battle in the West, I believe.
There were a couple of good battles before then, but Shiloh was the big one.
So, the Union strategy is basically to take control of the Mississippi River, which is the major. It's a major, commerce supply line for the Southerners in the West.
Yeah.
As well as some major cities, Vicksburg being one on the Mississippi River. Chattanooga, Tennessee, also being one on a major river. I'm not sure if it's the Mississippi it's on.
I don't think it's on the Mississippi, but you can get to it by like going up the Mississippi and over maybe the Ohio River. Yeah. But anyway, continue.
And then Savannah, Georgia.
That's on the Atlantic.
I'm sorry that you're right.
New Orleans, maybe.
I'm talking about New Orleans. Taking control of New Orleans, because that's where the South are getting supplies from.
Yeah.
Other countries.
Yeah.
And then in the East, mainly the Union strategy is to get control of Richmond, to either capture Richmond or simply destroy the Southern Army.
But still,
in the East.
Also, an extension of the Mississippi, though, is they do have a naval blockade, not only all the way around the Atlantic to try to just pinch off any supplies coming into the South and any exports. They want to keep them from selling their cotton because that was their moneymaker.
Right.
And I remember reading something too where where one of the guys in South Carolina was lamenting that like they should have prepared better for the war because they had this massive supply of cotton like already stored up, and he says we should have sold that before we went to war because then it's just stuck there. They couldn't get rid of it.
Interesting.
Anyway.
Yeah. So we shouldn't forget that along with the land forces, there were also naval battles because not only the North but the South also raised a navy.
Oh yeah, and I did want to say too. So going into this war, the U.S. did not have big armed forces.
Right.
Before the Civil War, they had 16,000 regulars. That's it. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have over 1 million today. And then also they had, I think, 40 naval ships total. And because most of those were overseas, just like at different ports throughout the world, I think at the beginning of the war they had 4 available ships. Mm. And so both of them, that was another aspect, is like quick
build more,
quick build a navy, and quick enlist as many people as you can. And so yeah, it was a lot of volunteer fighting. Right. Is that like you get the officers or regulars, but then most of it, when you hear like the 20th Maine or the whatever division of that state, those are volunteers.
Right. Yeah. Although later in the war there was a draft.
Yes, there was.
Forgot when exactly it was. It was near the end or the middle of the war in the North. But the Southern strategy, is basic. I'm not exactly sure. Remembering studying it, was it basically to wear out the North until they? Oh yeah, huge part of it. They wanted to get European support. Yeah. From Great Britain and or France. Yeah. So they were trying to what they were trying to do was show that they were a nation that could defend itself, that actually had power, that actually had viability, that actually had some way to benefit these European states like Great Britain. They had lots of negotiations.
Yeah. And Great Britain had a huge textile industry, so they were interested in all that cotton and the resources coming. And yeah, they basically took a page out of the Revolutionary War saying, we understand that the North is bigger, has more people, has more resources, but if we can just last long enough that it's not worth it for them. Right. If we can show them, blood, show them some blood and them to be like, yeah, you can go, because really this whole time, if the North decided it wasn't worth it, the war is over. And so that's their hope, is that if you had told them that the North would be in it for the long haul and would fight, just keep fighting no matter what, then yes, they probably would have guessed they wouldn't have won. Their hope was that if we keep winning a couple battles, win a few battles and show the North that this is going to take a lot longer than you think. And there were times where there was pressure from the North to
Northern politicians.
Yeah, and
there was actually a party.
And you even have, as we come into 1864, if Lincoln's going to be reelected. Those were the tickets. Vote for Lincoln and continue the war. Vote for, I think McClellan ran against him. Vote for McClellan and the war is over. The South can go on its way. Right. And so, that was the South's strategy. To go back to the West, I would like to hit a little bit on Ulysses S. Grant. Okay. So basically, that's when he the Battle of Shiloh and the couple battles before then, he quickly emerges as somebody who knows how to fight and fight well.
Was he in the Battle of Shiloh?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
He was the Union commanding officer.
Okay. I don't remember that.
Yeah. But I do want to go back in Ulysses Grant's history here, just because I thought this was fascinating. So he had been basically pushed out of the army about 10 years before, largely due to a drinking issue, and then goes into farming, fails at that, goes into business, fails at that, ends up he has to move back in with his dad, and is working. His dad's a tanner, so he's had to move back in and helping his dad, and hates tanning at the age of 39 years old when the war starts up, and he goes, I guess I'll rejoin the army, which I just thought was interesting in that, like, all right, so if you're 39 years old and living with your parents and things have gone horribly wrong for you.
But another part of his background was he did fight in the Mexican-American War.
He did, yes. Yeah.
So he was a West Point graduate, right?
He was, and he wasn't.
He was trained as a professional soldier.
He was trained as a professional soldier, and he had been, he was in the army as an officer, but he wasn't that good of a West Point cadet.
Yeah.
Which is, I guess, another point. Is it's interesting to look at the different officers, because a lot of these guys are from West Point. A lot of these guys know each other. Right. But you look at which ones were the better students, which ones were the best in West Point. That does not correlate to best at war.
Right. Exactly.
And you have a lot of these guys that are like, oh, he was a great student, or he's been a great military mind. He wrote a bunch of books about it, and they put this guy in charge, and it quickly becomes evident that he cannot command forces when bullets are actually flying.
Right. Well, you have to remember that most of the prominent famous commanders in the war had also fought in the Mexican-American War.
Oh, yeah.
Besides simply going to school to be soldiers, they had actually had combat experience.
Yeah, though I would say the Mexican-American War was a very quick.
Right, it was a lot different. But it was still some experience.
Yeah, it was some experience, and then also the technology, even from 1845 to 1860. The advancement in that was impressive.
Yeah.
And actually, the you probably know this, but the officer that rose through the ranks the most in the Mexican-American War.
Robert E. Lee.
Nope.
Jackson.
Yep, Stonewall Jackson.
Well, how did he rise through the ranks?
So as they were attacking Mexico City, there was a battery of artillery like up on a hill, and basically they're like, we won't be able to take Mexico City until we get rid of that. And Stonewall, well, he wasn't Stonewall yet, but right. Jackson, Thomas Jackson basically is like, well, I'll do it. And he takes his men, and common to Jackson, it wasn't like a great, super intelligent maneuver that tricked him. It was basically just to charge right up it and go, yeah, we'll just take our chances, but we'll take it because we're bold. Took it. And I think I forget how high he rose through the ranks, but it was more than any other officer in the whole U.S. Army.
Gotcha. So Grant is the commanding general in the west of the Northern forces. Is that right?
Yep. Well, so actually
eventually.
So he pretty much is at the beginning, and there's one guy above him that's like a paper pushing general.
Okay.
But after Grant wins the Battle of Shiloh, that general is like, well, the things are going well here. I want to take charge and actually get out there. So then he does, and that basically completely stalls the Union in the West.
Right. Because he's terrible.
Yeah, he moves things real slow, and Grant was just so frustrated. And I guess this is kind of a lesson too in like seeing people's giftings, what they're good at, and sometimes just letting them go at it. Like this guy very clearly should have just said, Grant, you're good at this, just keep going, instead of trying to take some of the glory for himself.
Yeah. So after Shiloh, the next major battle, I believe, is Second Manassas. It's near Manassas, Virginia again.
What year was that one?
That was in 1862, August of 1862.
Okay. When was Antietam?
That was the next month,
okay,
September.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So August of 1862, you have in the East. What it basically is until late 1863, Lincoln is trying to get a commander who's actually competent of the Union forces in the east because they keep getting defeated. At Second Manassas, it's General Pope is the commander of the Union forces. You have Lee, obviously, being the commander of the Southerners. And it's a huge victory for the Southerners. Again, speaking of Jackson is a key general in this battle. He leads a flank assault and basically, destroys, crushes the Union forces with his flank assault. Although, actually, I think it's Longstreet as well. Yeah. Anyway, it's a huge, decisive Southern victory. And after this, the Southerners go into Maryland, so they won that battle. Now the Union general commanding the Union Army is either Burnside or Hooker at the Battle of Antietam. They go to Maryland because they want to threaten Washington D.C. and basically get the Union Army out so they can have another victory. Yeah. And they decide to take a stand at the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, near Antietam Creek, and so on par with Shiloh, Shiloh was a 2-day battle. Antietam, though, is a 1-day battle, and in 1 day there are over 23,000 killed or wounded. And when we think of the casualties, it's mostly wounded. Yeah. Obviously, because
also a lot of captured.
Yes, yeah, a lot of people captured. But is the bloodiest day in American history in the Battle of Sharpsburg or Antietam? It is a tactical Union victory at the cost of thousands of casualties. So that the Confederates hold out for a long time, but then they're eventually forced to retreat after just horrible slaughter. Okay, so after Sharpsburg, so the Confederates are driven out of Maryland. They go back to Virginia.
If I may take a brief pause there, as far as like technology and the slaughter goes. So if you think about back to like the Revolutionary War, where everyone would face each other and shoot muskets at each other, this was before. So before at this time, they did not understand that you had to spin a bullet in the gun.
Yeah, they did. They had rifles.
Well,
you didn't have to, but it was cheaper, and you could mass produce.
Okay, but so most of them didn't, though.
Right.
So it's like you're throwing a knuckleball, and like 100 yards there's a good chance you don't hit your target.
Yeah.
And so they all just line up and face each other, and it was basically whoever could shoot the most bullets had the greatest chance that they would hit the most people.
Right.
By the Civil War, they are now using rifles and have bullets. That's what it was.
Balls.
The bullets had come a long way in that time too. So basically, when the ball is shot, it comes out spinning and can go much straighter, where you can get people. You can shoot accurately for 400 or 500 yards. You can even get people sharpshooters that can shoot further than that. And so at this point, all the way up into history, people have just charged each other.
Wow.
I shouldn't say just charged each other.
Yeah, they start out by just blasting away at each other.
Well, no, I'm saying it up until the Civil War.
Oh, okay.
The frontal assault charge has been a major part of battle, and so they're still doing it. But now that people have rifles, this is a bad idea.
Well, not always. It's not always a bad idea.
Okay, not always, but
it just
casualties
it results in way more people getting hurt.
Yeah, and and you see as the war goes on that trench warfare comes into play a lot more as they realize that frontal assaults are very, very costly to just charge at people that can shoot accurately.
It doesn't deter them from still doing it up until the end of the war, though.
No, it doesn't. But I think, like I said, you see them start to go more into trench warfare, and you can kind of see it going towards World War I, where trench warfare becomes the thing.
This is really the foreshadowing of World War I.
And then, and with that, kind of like you said, as they realize, and this is obviously not a new concept, but with realizing how costly a frontal assault is, it puts more emphasis on flanking.
Right.
On if we can somehow get somebody around the side, then that's how we'll win the battle.
Right. Although that was
No,
already a concept.
I know it was already a concept.
It's
I'm
more
saying
emphasis,
it's
though.
emphasized on it more because the frontal assault was not that effective anymore.
Right. I don't know what happens in the West in the later part of 1862, but in the winter of 1862, the Northern Army goes into Virginia, and they eventually get to the town of Fredericksburg, Virginia, where Burnside is the commanding officer of the Union forces, and he takes a stand on the heights of Fredericksburg, Virginia, and in that winter, November, I think it's November of 1862, the Southern Army, the Army of Northern Virginia, launches an assault at great cost on those heights, but the Northerners are so decimated that they are forced. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reversing it. It's the other way around. The Southerners are the ones on the heights,
so
defending
in
at
general,
Fredericksburg, and the Union forces launch largely futile assaults of waves of troops that get mowed down, and they are forced to basically withdraw.
In general, the South is the one. The North is the one attacking, and the South is
for the most part
on the defense because they don't have to attack.
Right.
It's the North that, like, if you want to win this war, you have to go beat them. The South's just like, we just want it to last until the North decides they're done.
Right. Eventually Grant is made the commander of the Union forces in the West, and I think it's in May of 1863.
I don't remember what day.
I think it's May 1863. Vicksburg is captured by the Union forces. That is a major Union victory that is decisive for the Union efforts.
And in general, there's a lot of focus on the East because the Confederates were winning in the East,
right? And also because that's where the two major
the major armies were.
Two capitals.
The West is not as well known, but basically under Grant, the Union did well out there.
Right, for the most part.
Yeah.
And it's the exact opposite in the East.
Yeah.
So after Fredericksburg, in May, the Battle of Chancellorsville is fought. That is a major, decisive Confederate victory, although Thomas Jackson is mortally wounded with a shot in the arm by his own troops, and he eventually contracts an illness, and he dies from that illness, so that loses Jackson.
He was very happy that he was dying on a Sunday, though. And
his last words were, "Let us cross the river and rest under the shade of the trees."
Yeah.
Which are pretty cool, epic words, last words for someone to speak.
I do want to say on Thomas Jackson, he was somebody that constantly put himself in danger. Mm-hmm. I mean, just out there, and when all of his aides and all the people would be like, you can't just put yourself out there, he'd say, when the Lord wills it for me to die, it'll be my time, and it won't be before then. Mm-hmm. I mean, so that's just his attitude on the whole thing.
He said it's not for us to determine the day that we die. God has determined that. So he has a famous quote where he says, "I am as at peace on the battlefield as I am lying in bed," or to paraphrase something that he said. So then, after the decisive defeat of the Union forces, I think at that point they are under Hooker at Chancellorsville, if I'm not mistaken. So Meade is now given the command of the Union forces because Hooker just got defeated. Yeah. So now the South, in the summer of 1863, they launched the famous assault into the North to draw out the Union Army and try to threaten Washington D.C. to make the Union people afraid that there is a Southern invasion of the North. So they go into Pennsylvania. They end up in Gettysburg with the famous Battle of Gettysburg. And we don't have time to get into all that.
Yeah, it's a shame.
But it's a pretty much it's a long 3-day battle, the biggest battle of the war and of a lot of history. Many casualties. I believe over 50,000 casualties altogether. And it's a Southern defeat, major Southern defeat. The Southerners are forced to go back into Virginia.
And this is one of the big parts of this was just that this was, as I said, usually the South was on the defensive. Mm-hmm. This was the one where Robert E. Lee said, God's going to give us the battle this time. Yeah. And just goes on a straight march and Pickett's charge right up a hill. at the Union at the end of the battle, thinking this is where we break through.
Right.
And that was just demoralizing. They got ripped to shreds.
Right. Although they did not.
They did breach. They did make a breach.
Yeah, I know. It did not. It did not shatter their confidence in their commander, because the Southern Army loved Lee.
Yeah.
He was like their father.
Yeah.
Almost.
Interesting enough, Longstreet was arguing for Lee to not do it,
right,
and to swing around behind, just disengage, swing around, get in between the Union and Washington D.C., and then they'd have to attack them.
Right. You can read the Killer Angels if you want to learn about it. But anyway, after the defeat at Gettysburg, so now the Southerners are on the defensive permanently.
Yeah,
really permanently. In the West, I don't know exactly what happens at the end of 18. Oh yeah, Chattanooga is captured by the Union forces in mid 1863, which is a major Confederate defeat. From that point forward, the Confederates are basically on the retreat in the West as well, in the Western theater of the war. Now, to bring up a religious revival, at the end, the autumn and winter, or around that time of 1863, there was a huge revival of religion on both sides, and thousands of soldiers are saved. What contributes to that? Why is that time? I'm not exactly sure, but it's a major thing that both sides talk about. D.L. Moody was a famous preacher that preached the Union forces. There are lots of Southern preachers in the Southern armies that preach to them, and soldiers are being saved by the thousands apparently at that time. By 1864, so the Union, obviously in the West, the Union they launch a plan to go all the way across the deep southern states until they reached Charleston, right?
May have been Atlanta. I think it was Atlanta.
Atlanta, Georgia. This is Sherman's march. So General Tecumseh Sherman is the commander of the Union forces in that march to basically destroy the supplies. So this is where they basically take it into total war. Yeah. We're going to just destroy them. We're going to treat them as we're gonna throw out the rules of civility and simply just killing soldiers.
Which this is,
but we're going to destroy their factories, their supplies, their farms. We're going to demoralize them. We're going to show them that we mean no mercy.
And this is where you see the effects of Ulysses Grant. He was one of the first guys to understand that we're in total war here. This isn't just a one battle thing. Right. And so he sends Sherman, and he was actually, his nickname was Unconditional Surrender Grant. Mm-hmm. That's what U.S. was for. But yeah, and so you see this.
Ulysses was actually his first name.
No, I know.
Oh, okay.
I'm saying they took it. They changed it to me because the first battle he was in, he had sieged a town or whatever, and the West Point Confederate that was in control had been a friend of his, and had loaned him money back in the day. And so when he asked for terms of surrender, and Grant replies, "No terms, unconditional surrender."
I think that was Vicksburg. If I'm not mistaken.
No, this was an earlier one, a smaller one. I mean, he may have said this, he probably said unconditional surrender each time, but this was the one that started off the nickname for him because it was a friend of his, and it was at the very beginning of the war, and he's like, "No, we're not doing any terms. Yeah. You just have to surrender immediately."
Yeah. To speed up, so basically the northern troops destroy the deep south states like Georgia, Arkansas, and Georgia. I said Georgia. And Tennessee, I think. It's basically Georgia, mostly. Yeah. Most marches.
A lot of Tennessee and Arkansas, they've slowly moved down through for a while at this point, anyway.
Yeah. So Georgia's basically destroyed. Atlanta is eventually, and Savannah, I think,
just burned to the ground.
Atlanta is eventually captured, and in the Eastern Theater near Richmond, the Grant's and Lincoln's idea is basically to just pummel the Southern Army until they either destroy the Southern Army or capture Richmond. They just keep going toward Richmond through many bloody battles like the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse and Petersburg, the Battle of the Crater. Eventually, they get to Petersburg, which is right next to Richmond, and the Confederate forces are basically under siege with trenches. And they're driven eventually from their trenches and they're forced to basically be pursued. This ragtag band of only tens of thousands of forces now, of the Southerners being chased by hundreds of thousands of Union forces, and eventually Grant gets Lee to Appomatox Courthouse, where he forces him. Lee sees there's no hope whatsoever of them maintaining a war where there's any good chance of them holding out. So he surrenders his army, and a little later, eventually the Southern forces surrender as well, and so this begins Reconstruction, where the North, they have to reconcile to each other, obviously, and the North wants to make sure that the South are going to assimilate back into the Union and cooperate with them. And this
we could
poses lots of problems.
What if we include the Reconstruction a bit more in the next one?
Okay.
And then we can just do some wrap up on the actual Civil War effects.
Okay. Well, let's just touch on
go for it.
Touch on some of the major ones. So Emancipation Proclamation is in 1862.
Yep.
So technically, slaves are free by federal law in the South. This is hugely problematic in the South because they don't really have much means to start new lives without being helped by their former masters. So they are, they are still an oppressed, poor portion of the society in the South. There are a lot of Northerners that are hating. Obviously, there's a lot of hatred on both sides, which is huge problem with them getting along. There are Northern politicians appointed by the North in the South, right, to rule these. Yeah. Basically, the South is a military state under federal military occupation.
Yeah.
And so they want to make sure that you Southerners are going to cooperate with us. Now, most of the Southern generals, they did not go on fighting. They peacefully surrendered, especially Lee. And so they're able to assimilate back into American society. And from this point forward, basically, it's clear industrialization is the way forward for the United States. Slavery is obviously out of the question. We're not going to continue slavery whatsoever. There's eventually going to be some push to get rid of it. However, there are obviously Southern groups that want to continue the oppression of blacks. Like the Ku Klux Klan, for example, which is led by Forrest, who eventually becomes a believer. He's converted.
Actually, interesting. So Nathan Bedford Forrest. Have you ever read Gone with the Wind?
No.
Oh, it's a long book, but it's pretty good. Southern perspective, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And for the beginning of the Ku Klux Klan, that was the only time I ever read anything that was like, oh, like that makes sense a little bit. Mm-hmm. Was when the Union forces basically come down and it's like a military state, and a lot of the black people come to the cities for the handouts, and the Southerners have no rights at that point. They're not like back in as citizens really. And one of the things that was happening was the Southerners were being treated very badly. And so, for instance, and it was a thing, I don't know how common it was, but for a black slave to go after a mistress that they used to have. And so what initially kicked off the Ku Klux Klan was the raping of some of the Southern women.
Oh.
And them going to the government, and the government basically being like, no, like nothing. Like,
not going to do anything.
They weren't going to do anything, so you get some of the Southern men, who had been generals, who had fought in the Civil War, to be like, we're not just going to take that sitting down. And so that was the supposedly that was the starting of the Ku Klux Klan. Obviously, it turned into a lot, snowballed from there.
Right.
But when I heard that explanation, I was like, oh, I mean, like, not that I think it's good, but just like that makes more sense.
Yeah. Right. So Lincoln is assassinated in 1865. That's the era. Yeah, by this crazy guy, John Wilkes Booth, who eventually gets killed. And then, so we have to remember the results of war. thousands of former soldiers have to go back to their lives and start civilian lives.
You also get a lot of the army sent out west to deal with Indians. It's just kind of now we have this whole group of men that are used to fighting.
Right. So the factories in the North were ramped up during the war. There's an upstart, obviously, of economic progress and growth in the North.
Yeah. And I would say for technology, things that really either affected the war or came about because of the war would be like the telegram. That was before the war, but like that changed when you can have your commander not be on the front line, and a lot of times they still were, but like Abraham Lincoln can get news immediately.
Yeah. Right.
You have hospitals. This is where they started up at first it was like not like terrible medicine. By the end of the war, it'd come a long ways.
Yeah.
And you actually
Carol
have
Barton.
Yep.
Founder of the American Red Cross.
And you have ambulances. You have the starting of hospitals.
Right. Horse-drawn ambulances.
Yeah, of course. Hopefully the horses ran fast. Obvious, as I already said, the railroads are in use. The weapons have are better, and also the idea of how to use artillery has really enhanced. Mm-hmm. You have standardization of items, like shoe sizes, for instance. That you'd have, that was like when that was developed, to send out to the Union soldiers, and then also canned food, like so just these are just a lot of technological things that you don't really think about that much, but when you think about how they affect war, like big impacts, and you see these develop or they were just new coming into the war. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to conclude. One major thing is the religious element of it, spiritual element. This showed Americans that this is not a utopia. This is not heaven on earth. That this nation is just as messed up as every other nation, and that we are still capable of killing each other in horrible ways and treating each other very poorly. So this forces. So the Christian denominations, actually, most of them were universal, were both in the North and in the South before the war. And then because of the war, most of them were divided between North and South. Now they have to reconcile with each other. They have to remember that although we were on opposite sides during a war because of our consciences, now we have to remember that we need to work together to heal the wounds that have been dealt with, or that have been dealt during the war, and come together in unity. And because of those revivals that happened during the war, this really promotes Christianity to a great extent in both northern and southern societies. Although from this point forward, besides Reconstruction, we enter into the age of imperialism and the Gilded Age, where you start seeing monopolies and things, greediness with capitalism starting up. So it's really, although it has good effects from the religious revivals and the fact of war showing people you need to get right with God, a lot of times, it also shows people that we can make a lot of money with the tragedies of human events. Do you have any closing thoughts, Casey?
No, that sounded good to me.
Lessons we can learn. So, we're in a divided society in America and also in the Western world. Let's remember that we are brothers and sisters in Christ, and let's not fight with each other on matters that are not essentials. I think is probably a good takeaway from it. That we need to unite together for the progress of the gospel, not for the progress simply of our political desires or economic desires, but for the desires of the expansion of Christ's kingdom and His glory and the salvation of souls. So let's do that. Let's be united, not divided, like the nation was in the American Civil War. With that, I think we'll close. Thanks for listening to another edition of the King's Hand in History podcast. If you are on Facebook, consider joining the King's Hand in History students group. And please think about giving us a like and or a subscription or follow on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Until next time, look for the King's Hand in History, and God bless.